Welcome to Church Online. Happy Father's Day to all the fathers out there, and thank you for joining us. Last week, Pastor Ben was speaking about Noah, and this week we are continuing our Big Butts series, and Pastor Maria will be preaching about Abraham and his big butts. I encourage you to drop a comment down below anytime during the video to start a conversation or ask any questions. Pastor Maria will be speaking shortly, so enjoy.
Is my butt too big? Is my butt too big for your plan, God? And this morning we're going into Abraham. And why Abraham? Well, he was known as the father of many nations. What do we know the song, right? Father Abraham has many sons has Father Abraham. Anyways, let's stop right there. Let's unpack that song for a second. That's enough, honey. That's enough. Let's unpack that song. So it starts off by saying, Father Abraham has many sons. The promise of God being the father of Israel actually was one son. It's an interesting song that we teach our kids about the truth about God's promise in Abraham's life. But the promise in Abraham's life actually was this one son that the whole nation came through. And we're going to go through Abraham's life. And I think the important part of understanding Abraham's life is that it touches on so many pieces that we deal with in our own lives as Christians. Right from the beginning where we don't know Christ, all the way through to trying to walk out the calling that he has for us. But the biggest thing that you will see through Abraham's life is it never looks like what you think it's going to. We hear the story and we think of the story as being father of nations. He is this father of many sons. He is the father, of the Israelites. But that promise was only one son. It was one specific son that this promise came through. And I wonder if that was the picture when God began the promise back in chapter 12 of you will be the father of nations. If Abraham thought that meant I will have this one son that then will father the nations. Did I ever thought of that, or is it just me? That I wonder if there was a moment in his life where he, at the end, thought, well, that didn't turn out how I anticipated it to. I didn't really know that that's what it was going to look like. And on this end of it, we see the beauty of it. But I wonder if Abraham, in the midst of it, saw the beauty of it. There's something to be learned there. So we're going to go this morning from Genesis chapter 11 all the way through to Genesis chapter 22, and we're going to read it all. I like how a few people laughed. Some people are like, we're not sure if we're supposed to laugh. I'm not going to read it all. But we are going to go through that. My homework for you this week is to take those chapters. So that is Genesis chapter 11 all the way through to Genesis chapter 22. Take it home and this week read through it. Why? Because it's really some great truths in there to unpack. And I'm just going to touch on them this morning. So we're picking up our story at the end of Genesis chapter 11. Genesis chapter 11 verse 31. It says this. Terah took his son Abram, his grandson Lot, son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, the wife of his son Abram, and together they set out from Ur to go to Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. Abraham, the first time we hear about him is this journey of his dad making a decision that he's going to pick him up, and they're going to start to travel towards Canaan. They didn't make it to Canaan. They stopped earlier than that, but they started going towards there. And I think this is where we see our first but. The amount of times I have heard people who are trying to figure out spirituality say something like this to me, but God doesn't know me. But God doesn't know what I've been through. But God doesn't know where I've been. God doesn't know the hand that I've been dealt. Where was God in blank? And I think when we pick up the beginning of Abraham's story, what we see is that God put Abraham's life on a path before Abraham knew it. Do you see that? God put him on the path for his destiny before he knew it. He was on the path to the promise before Abraham knew there was even a promise. The amazing thing is that God is always working, whether or not we see it or we don't. And I don't know everyone's journey here, if whether or not you know Christ yet or you're just trying to figure that out. But what I want you to know is that time and time again, what I hear when I listen to people's stories is that God has intersected them multiple times before they knew he was intersecting them, before they became aware of it. And then we move on. Genesis chapter 12, verses 2 and 3. This is where we hear God speak to Abraham, and it's the big promise, the big calling that God shares with him. And it says this: I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curse you, I will curse, and all people on earth will be blessed through you. See, our journey with God often starts where we don't even see him at work, to all of a sudden we realize that he is there, and he says, here's my promise for you, here is my calling over your life. And I think we go through two things at that point. One of them is this excitement of, oh my goodness, God has something great for me. And then quickly, it's usually realizing, what else does he say in there? He says, you need to pick up and move now. There's the excitement that comes in of, oh my goodness, God has spoke to me. He has something for my life. But then there's the but, I like my comfort. But God, I like the comfort of my life. See, at this point, Abraham didn't know how long of a journey he was going to be in for. He could have thought it was going to be fulfilled in the next year. He was 75 years old at this point. He was childless and 75 years old. And God gives him the promise that I'm going to make you the father of nations. I'm going to bless the whole entire world through you. Anyone else would like to hear that promise from God? Can you imagine? I'm going to bless the whole world through you. I'm going to make you the father of nations. I mean, that first part, I think, actually would just terrify me. I had two little ones. Our third child came, and he was already a teenager, so I didn't have to parent him when he was a toddler. It's probably a good thing. I can't imagine having more children than that. Anyone who does, I think you are a saint. I mean it. That takes some patience. That takes some fortitude. I figured two little ones at a time. James had an arm for one, and I had an arm for one. Anything I could handle. You put a third one in the mix, and it's like chaos. You know, three, when they're little, at any given time, one could be doing who knows what, because you only have two hands. There's no way to contain three. There is a way to contain two. I am learning that now as they've been older. You think that would pass as they were toddlers. But now I've got two teenagers and one, well, he's not a teenager, but he kind of is a teenager still. Is Stu in here? I don't know where he is. Oh, there you are. He kind of is, right, Stu? We're aware. There's still some teenager in you. We're working on it, but it's still there. So I've got two teenagers. He's really a young adult guy. And we know young adult guys, until they're about 25, are pretty much still a teenager. And then we have our preteen. And so I thought that, just when they're little, that's the only time you had to worry about being able to keep track of them. It's not true. It's not true. Any given day, I don't know what one of them is doing or where they are. But it's good. It's all good. Anyways, my point is that the father of nations would terrify me. But I'm sure that in this day, in this time, especially because Abraham probably didn't have to father a whole lot, because in this time, mothers did mostly everything. So he's probably super excited. I'm going to be a blessing to the world. But then God says this, but I want you to pick up everything you know away from all of your family, all of your friends, all of your comfort, and go on the move again. In order for you to reach your promise, you need to leave your comfort. And I would imagine that Abraham probably would have thought the same thing that most of us do when God says something like that too. But I like my comfort. I like my stuff. I like my time. I like my fill in the blank. And often when God calls us to something, He's calling us to leave something too. Ben's analogy last week when he preached about your hand being closed, the reality is a hand can only hold so much. And if you're holding on to things too tightly, God can't put anything else in there. So often he's removing things so he can put new things there. Abraham was 75 years old, had no children. But yet we see this excitement in him, and the excitement overcame the fear of leaving everything. And he goes on this journey and says, okay, God, I'm all in. Let me see the promise. And then we see he comes against, as he's traveling into this country, he comes against this self-preservation again. Because often we go from, God, I don't know you. I'm trying to figure out who you are. To I know who you are, and I know you have something for my life, and I've got this excitement in me to go for it. To we come against an obstacle. And self-preservation comes up. So when you go into Genesis chapter 12, 10 to 20, we're not going to read it. You can, 10 to 20. They go in, and Abraham realizes that his wife's beauty may cause someone to kill him and take his wife. So he goes in and he tells them, she's my sister. Because he figures if I say she's my sister, they won't want to kill me. So the king takes his wife as to be his wife. And then God steps in and says, what are you doing? And tells this king, who doesn't even know this God, saying, hey, this woman is already married to someone. And then the king goes to Abraham and says, why did you lie to me? And Abraham basically says, well, I wasn't really lying. I just was a little worried. Here's the thing we don't realize sometimes when we read this passage. We might think that Abraham's just outward lying. He wasn't actually lying. He was just omitting the truth that mattered. Sarah was his half-sister. Before we get into the idea of incest, it was normal in that day. That was just what they did. But she was his half-sister. How often do we go from God's promise into trying to walk out his calling, and something comes up about self-preservation, something comes up that says God's tugging at her heart saying, actually, I want you to get rid of that. Actually, this isn't healthy. I want to shave that part off of your life. And we just omit that truth, and we just focus on a truth that doesn't really matter. And then we say something to God about like this, but God, I wasn't lying. I wasn't really lying. I just wasn't telling the whole truth. What does that look like? That often looks like we look at the big things, the big sins, the big issues in our life, and we're okay dealing with those. But sometimes it's the smaller things that keep us from walking out the fullness of what God wants for us. And those are the things that are a struggle to kind of change, right? And those are the truths that we try to kind of just brush under the rug. I had a conversation this week with a friend as we were sitting and chatting, and he said something super wise to me. And he said, sometimes maybe we don't need to spend as much time figuring out what's right and wrong if we just spent more time doing what God has asked us to do. Because if you're focused on what you know God wants you to do, you don't need to worry so much about what God doesn't want you to do. If your focus is on the complete truth, the whole truth, that brings life to you, that puts you on a path for God's fullness, then you don't have to worry so much about the list of things that maybe you shouldn't be doing or can I do. Because your life is consumed with what you know God wants you to do. What we see, though, is God's grace. God didn't say, hey, you know what, Abraham, you're a liar. I'm done with you. I'm going to move my promise to someone else. He's gracious enough to say, okay, let's keep on going. And we're not going to talk about it, but if you read through all those chapters, you will see that he does this exact same thing again. A few chapters down the road, and God again picks him up and say, let's keep on going. So he's 75 years old, and he's waiting for God's promise. There's an excitement in him. How many of you have ever had a prophetic word, a word of knowledge, something, or God has given you a vision, something where the Holy Spirit has made it clear to you about a direction that you're supposed to go or a promise over your life? Anyone here had that? Keep your hands up. How many of you have gotten discouraged along the way when you haven't seen it come to fruition? How many of you are still waiting? See, we all understand what Abraham's going through. So there's this excitement, right? There's this excitement when someone speaks something over your life, when you hear God's calling and you're like, I'm do anything. I will do anything it takes to get to where you want me to go. And then life happens. We move on to chapter 15. A bunch of stuff happens. Chapter 15. It has been now over 10 years since God spoke this promise to Abraham. 10 years where Abraham has fumbled but tried to be faithful, tried to show the nation around him, the people around him, righteousness and what God meant. You can read through those stories through the last few chapters. But he's getting discouraged, and him and God have this conversation. And Abraham says this, but Abraham said, O sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? And the one who will inherit my estate is of Damascus. And Abraham said, you have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. He's basically saying, God, like you promised me something, and I'm still childless. Like it's been 10 years. Time is going. He's 86 years old. His wife is old. And he's feeling like you promised me this. And you are growing me, and you've grown my estate, and I have all this stuff. And what? One of my servants is just going to inherit it all because I still don't have a child. He's questioning God. We all get there. God gives us this promise in our life, this calling over our life, and there's an excitement in it, and there should be. And then life happens, and years go by, and then we sit and we feel like, God, like you said this, but I'm not sure I believe you anymore. I don't really know, God. It's been a long time. And then verse 4, it says, then the word of the Lord came to him, this man will not be your heir, but a son coming from your own body will be your heir. He took him outside and said, look up to the heavens and count the stars. If indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. And Abraham believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. Those of you who have had a word, put your hand back up. Something, vision, right? How many of you have had that word affirmed by someone else? Again. And in that moment, you have a choice to make, don't you? Do I choose to believe that God is speaking, or do I choose to give up? Put your hands down. Abraham had this choice, and he chose to say, I don't understand. It's been 10 years. This seems overwhelming, but I'm choosing your promise over my life. Because sometimes God's calling is a choice and not a feeling. Sometimes our emotions are excited about God's calling, and sometimes it is a fortitude that says, God, I have no strength left in me to stand on this promise, but I'm going to do it anyway. There's nothing left to hold on to, but God, I'm going to hold on anyway. And that's where Abraham's been. It's been 10 years, and he's waiting, and he's old, and he has no kids. And he's saying, but you saying it, so I'm going to believe it. But God, it's taking too long. We've all said it. And the amount of people, especially in ministry. We've been in ministry most of our whole marriage in some capacity. The amount of people that we've seen that have come and gone because something happens and they let go of God's promise. Sometimes it's for a season and God is healing them in that season. Sometimes is that they're just too discouraged and they let go of God's promise. And James and I have sat often and looked at each other and have cried and wept together to watch that. Because God's promise didn't change. But the fortitude to stand on it sometimes becomes unbearable. When we try to do it on our own, it is. But what Abraham realized is, God, if you said it, then you're going to sustain me through it. We move on then. And so Abraham, this excitement is reinvigorated in him. But then it's not too long later. It's only about a year. He was about 85 when this promise came again. God gave him a little bit bigger a picture. No, I'm telling you, your offspring, your descendants are going to be as many as the stars. This wasn't just a metaphor. There's actually a child that's coming through your body. It's not just a child that you're helping parent. It's not just, there's a child that is coming through your body, that's my promise. Very clear. And less than a year goes by. And Abraham does what we do. Is he got restless and he got worried. And he said, maybe, but God, I think you need help. Anyone else that have had a word, a prophecy, something, put your hands back up. How many of you have felt somewhere along that journey, God, maybe you need a little help? Maybe I am going to just step in and just nudge a little. Maybe you're just busy, you have a lot going on. So maybe if I just start to try and kick down a few of the doors, not all of them, I'll still let you open some, but maybe if I just give a little bit more of a shove, I can help you along. That's what Abraham does, and it's the story of Ishmael, where then Abraham goes and he sleeps with his wife's maidservant, and they have a child, and he says, okay, maybe I'll just have a kid with someone who is like your servant, which is kind of like you, and then that's how God can fulfill the promise. Let me just help him out a little. I'm not convinced that he can do it on his own, so I'm just going to come, I'm going to help him a little bit. As we were preparing together, we've been doing that through this sermon series as a team. We get together during the week and we kind of collaborate on what we're going to speak on and go over information. And one of the teams said this. He said, sometimes we like to do it ourselves plan. I don't know anyone who has kids here, but the big thing right now is those DIY YouTube videos, which usually turn into little bits of paper and sparkles and glue everywhere. and something at the end that is totally useless and not needed at all. But again, you smile and you pretend that it's amazing. But sometimes we step in with our own do-it-yourself plan, saying, God, okay, I'm not sure. Your plan seems to be taking too long, so I'm just going to step in and I'm going to try and push open the doors. I'm going to do it myself. But what comes from it is the same thing that came from Abraham trying to do that, is a bit of a disaster. Anyone else been there, or is it just me? Where sometimes we try and do and make God's plan happen, and at the end of the day, you look back and you say, I think that made it worse. I know that made it worse. That was not better. But it's so tempting when all this time goes by and you're trying so hard to hold on to his promise or his calling or that excitement, and it just seems like you're getting nowhere, and you say, okay, I'm just going to try and help a little. And God then calls Abraham to do something that says, okay, if you don't get it, I'm going to give you a physical reminder. We go into chapter 17. And God has this conversation with Abraham, and he says, okay, if you don't understand, I'm telling you that you are going to be set apart. So I'm going to give you a physical reminder to make you set apart. And at this 86, 87, somewhere around there, oh no, he was 99. I even have it in my notes. He was 99. He was 99 at the time. God says, Kate, you didn't get it, so I'm going to give you a physical reminder. I want you to circumcise yourself at 99 years old. Let's just think about the ramifications of that. Like, we're not talking about modern medicine here. There isn't like lidocaine. Isn't that the stuff that freezes things? That's what it's called, right? Nurses, is that the stuff that freezes things? Lidocaine, is that what it's called? I don't know. There's no like freezing. It's like God says, hey, I want you to circumcise yourself. Yeah, I know it's a little uncomfortable to think about in church, but let's just think about that for a second. 99 years old. And he tells Abraham, I want you to circumcise yourself because I think that you're going to have something that actually shows you this is what I mean. You are set apart. Every man after you in that line will do the same. And he had been waiting for his promise by this time, almost 25 years. And I feel like the conversation between him and God kind of would have went a little bit like this. But God, I think I already have enough skin in the game. I know it's a little risky of a joke. Please don't kick me off the stage. But it's kind of true, right? Like, I think he'd probably say, but God, I think that's a little too far. Like, a little bit too much. Like, I have been waiting 25 years. I have tried to be faithful. You've told me that I am righteous before you. You have expanded things. But Abraham, feeling like, I think I've done enough. And God says, no, you haven't. Because I need you to have a reminder. I need that there to be a reminder for you and the air that I'm giving you, that you are set apart, that there is something different there. And I don't know about you, but I feel like that probably would have been a difficult conversation for him to have. Anyone else think that probably was one of the most difficult things that God asked Abraham to do? I mean, I'm not a man, but I would imagine that men would understand this as being a very difficult thing to ask him to do. But he did it, and he did it faithfully. I also feel like in these moments, and again, it might just be my perception on what Scripture says, but how many of us, when we get to the point of God's promise, and at this point, God reminds him again, and he says it very clearly, and he goes through and says, no, I am going to give your wife a son. This is what you're going to call him. This is what your life is going to look like. And Abraham doesn't see it yet, but God gives him this very detailed plan. And I don't know, but I think there's probably a moment where he felt frustrated, where he almost probably felt like a slap in the face. Has anyone else been there? Let's put your hands back up. Those of you who've had a promise, a vision, something, a word from God, put your hands up. Okay. How many of you have had the third person now come or third person say almost the exact same thing? How many of you at that point maybe relate to me that instead of feeling excitement, you feel a little frustrated? Right, let's be honest. We should be excited, God's speaking to us, but there is this frustration almost that says, it's been 25 years and I'm nothing. Like, I'm trying here. James and I know, like, through seasons of our lives, like, there's a 10-year period. The first kind of 10 years we had people tell us the same thing over and over. And I think by about the sixth time, we went home, and life was chaos at that time, and we're trying to manage a whole lot, and we looked at each other without really even saying anything. I think there was just this level of frustration of like, God, I just don't care anymore. I mean, that sounds awful, but I think that's part of our hearts, right? Is like, great, you have some promise for my life. Wonderful. I'm just trying to make it through today, and I'm not seeing any of it. So why do you keep on telling me? Just let me do my thing, and when it comes, it comes. Why do you keep on bringing it up? Why do you keep on rubbing salt in the wound that I haven't seen your calling be fulfilled? I haven't seen your promise happen. Maybe that makes me really ungodly to have those feelings. I'm sorry. You may not want me to be your pastor anymore. That's okay. You might have to find a different church, but I mean, it's okay. But that's our human reaction to God. Like, you've said this over and over and nothing is changing. And then our hearts turn to repentance before God of like, oh my goodness, God, you are so big and so great, and I'm so sorry that I felt like that. But it is real. It's what we really go through. And I feel like after 25 years, Abraham would have felt some of that, especially when God was now asking him to do something even more that would solidify, you're going to hold on to my promise, when Abraham is thinking, I don't know if I really believe you anymore. But he does. He holds on to it. And about a year later, he's about 100 at this time, in Genesis 21, Abraham is given a son through Sarah. They name him Isaac. The promise comes. The calling is there. And he gets to live in the joy of that moment. But what we might not realize is right before that, chapter 20, verse 17, this is what God asks Abraham to do before he knows he has his own heir coming. He asked him to do this. Then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, his wife, and his slave girls, so that they could have children again. For the Lord had closed up every womb in his household because of Abraham's wife Sarah. So before Abraham sees the fullness of his promise, God actually asks him for that promise to come to a different nation. Have you thought about the ramifications of that? It's like saying, God, you have given me this promise and this calling, and God says, the last thing I want from you before you're going to see it is you need to release it and pray for someone else to get it. As I read through all these chapters, and I had to sit back, and I thought, what humility, what sacrifice that would be for this man who has been waiting 25 years to see his promise. And God keeps on reminding him it's going to be his. And then he says, but I want you to pray for this nation, that they will experience the blessing that you are waiting for. I don't want you to sit and grieve with them and understand their pain, I want you to pray blessing over them. I want you to pray that they will receive everything that you are desiring for yourself. Such a beautiful moment. I believe for us, that's often the last piece of the puzzle as we go along our journeys of God fulfilling the promises and the calling in our life, is that we have to come to a moment where we're saying, God, I just desire your plan so much that I'm okay if it comes through someone else. I just desire what you want so much that I don't even care if I'm a part of it. I'm willing to lay it all down for the sake of you. But God honors that prayer, and he gives Abraham this son. And then we jump into chapter 22. This is where we're going to land this morning. So Abraham has this son, and he is raising this child. He's living in the promise. He's living in the calling. He's living in the joy of seeing what God had said for 25 years being fulfilled. He's getting to enjoy that space. And then all of a sudden God comes to him and he says, but I want you to take your son and sacrifice him. I want you to take your son and I want you to sacrifice him. Now, before we think, wow, that's like really weird. It probably wasn't that weird. Again, as we were unpacking this together as a team, some stuff came to light. Is that the nations around them had served the god of Moloch. Now, the god of Moloch, in their culture, would demand child sacrifices. It was very normal for families to sacrifice one of their children, and through that sacrifice, they believed that they would get prosperity. So this was a very normal practice that he would have seen happen all the time. People took their kids. Seems awful to us, but this was normal for their culture. They would sacrifice to this god and believe that they would get prosperity through it. So although Abraham was probably confused by that request, it probably didn't seem quite as shocking as it would to us today. He probably had to wrestle with this idea, but God, you're different than the other gods. Why would you expect the same thing? But God, this is the promise. And I think that's really what he wrestled with, is God, this was my promise, and now you want me to give it up? This is my calling. This is what I waited how many years to see, and you want me to give it up? I think there's something very important in this story. We can go in and understand the metaphor that this is of Christ coming, and he is going to be the lamb, and God's going to have to sacrifice his own son so that we can have salvation. That God is faithful to always provide the lamb when we need it. We could go in and we could talk about Abraham's faithfulness in being obedient to what God asked him to do. But I think what we really need to realize is that what God is saying here is that your identity is not in your promise, and you need to hold even your promise with an open hand. Is that when you look back, that those 25 years, why they became so difficult for him to hold on to. Often when we put up our hands and we say, yeah, we felt frustrated when God keeps on saying the same thing over and over. The reason why there's that frustration is because part of who we are gets attached to that promise. You've ever heard the term being an adrenaline junkie? I think sometimes we can become junkies for God's promises instead of faithful in the relationship he's called us to. The promise is amazing, and it's amazing that God gives us promises and callings over our lives, and we should desire to know them, and we should desire to live them out. Absolutely. But that's not the number one priority. The number one priority is a relationship with Jesus Christ. The number one priority is an active relationship with a God who loves us. And our focus needs to be on that, because that is where the promise always comes from.
Thank you for joining us today. Drop a comment to start a conversation or ask any questions. And remember to like and share this video if you enjoyed Pastor Bree's message. And if you want to hear more about Abraham, visit our YouTube channel for part 2 on Wednesday. See you later.